and over to you.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have this? Please move this window away from the shared
Yes, please.
application
You shouldn't
window.
share and share again.
All right.
It's fine now. It's not showing.
Okay, good. So I titled this series of lectures, two-part series, The Real H.P. Blavatsky, with a question mark, because I have a strong belief that we don't really know the full dimensionality of who HPB is unless we're aware of her articles, in addition to her great books. And in my experience, being a national and even an international lecturer for the Theosophical Society, I've often come in contact with people who were not very well versed in this magnificent treasure trove of HPB's collected writings. So, what we'll be doing this evening is talking about the later volumes. I covered the first 9 volumes in the previous talk, and I'll be doing the remaining volumes, which include volumes 10 through 14 and an index today. And the purpose, okay, just the purpose of this talk is to address a number of different audiences. This slide is something that I brought forward from the previous talk. First of all, students of Theosophy who may be intimidated by how many pages are involved with the collected writings, hundreds and hundreds per volume times 14 volumes. Study groups that are looking for discussion material that may feel that, for example, the secret doctrine is a much too big and long-term project to deal with on a weekly basis. Scholars of the Theosophical movement who aren't really aware of the contents of the collected writings. I was at a conference at Harvard in 2019, and it seemed as if the majority of the couple dozen scholars who were there were not really citing anything beyond the first volume of The Secret Doctrine and maybe a couple, The Key to Theosophy. So it seemed like this was a neglected resource for scholars. And then I've had some interesting interactions with people on Facebook where sometimes there were other theosophists who were attacking people who were bringing forward some of the later theosophists under the heading of neo-theosophy. And I discovered that if I cited things from the collected writings that actually supported what the so-called neo-theosophists were saying, these harmful conversations actually stopped. So I considered this to be a non-harming approach to dealing with people who, for some reason, have a very narrow view of what theosophy is or should be. So again, a borrowed slide from the previous talk. This is a little house cleaning before we get into our subject for today. I misspoke with respect to a couple of items about Boris de Zurkov, who, as many of you know, was the editor of the collected writings. So I wanted to add a slide of biographical information as a bit of background to correct those things that I had said earlier. I did mention correctly that he was a relative of HPB, the son of a second cousin. This was something that I did not get quite right. He came to live at the T.S. Point Loma community near San Diego, California in 1923. He had fled from the revolution in Russia. He began the collected writings project shortly after he arrived there in 1924 as quite a young man. And he was also the editor of an independent theosophical journal, Theosophia, which he edited from 1944 until his death in 1981. Now, there was a second item of house cleaning, a question that came up during the question answer section that I was not fully prepared to answer, and I did a little follow-up research, so I want to make sure that people have access to that new information. The question concerned the difference between occultism and theosophy. And the point that I made was that many of the teachings and the term itself, occultism, in some respects has its origin in the writings of Eliphas Levi, whose original name, his birth name was Alphonse Louis Constant, 1810 to 75. And the particular text that I cited, which was cited incorrectly, was a letter of one of the students of Levi, Baron Nicholas Joseph Spedalieri, who became a TS member in 1880 and knew the founders, Alcott and Blavatsky. And there was an exchange of letters between Levi and Spedalieri that included over 1,000 letters from 1861 until just before the death of Levi in 1874. Many excerpts from these letters were translated in Lucifer, so of course that's something that will be coming out with the project that Erica has been working on. And the particular text that I was citing is something that I found in Arthur Edward Waite's book, The Mysteries of Magic, a digest of the writings of Eliphas Levi, 1897. And he called it the Creed of the Magus, but it is also known elsewhere on the web as Confession of Faith. And I've included a place where you can look at the original 1897 publication of this. My point was that this Creed of the Magus, or Confession of Faith, is strikingly similar to the ethics that are described in the Key to Theosophy, and many of the beliefs associated with this creed are also very similar to those of Theosophy, but are phrased in a somewhat different way. And I think it's important for people to know the history of how HPB took Levi's occultism and then refined it in some respects into Theosophy. And this creed is actually an important and perhaps missing piece of that progress. So now we'll go on to talking about the volumes of the collected writings. As I did before, what I do is I show the cover of each book. I talk briefly about the events that are important in HPB's life and publishing career. I then list some of the gems of each volume and come up with a quotation that I think to be something that many people who do not know the collected writings may have missed, that I think is an important resource. And some of these are informational, some of them are about the ethics, some of them demonstrate HPB's sense of humor along the lines of this idea of the real H.P. Blavatsky. And in this talk especially, I'll be referring to a number of subsequent publications that came out after the collected writings that are important for students and scholars to know about. So HPB was in London during the period covered by Volume 10. The Secret Doctrine was published, of course, in 1888 during this period. The Esoteric section, or Esoteric School of Theosophy, or sometimes called the Eastern School of Theosophy, was also founded during this year of 1888, covered by Volume 10. And in particular, in 1889, HPB dedicated several months to oral teachings on the contents of the Secret Doctrine, going through and explicating many of the stanzas of Dhyan. Some gems that you'll find in the collected writings. I always mention the Chronological Survey because it is one of the important gems. Deeply researched, it often gives you the exact dates of many things that HPB or Alcott were involved in, dates important to the formation of and evolution of the Theosophical Society. And I think it's an underused resource by scholars. Articles of importance, Lodges of Magic, Is Theosophy a Religion, which I think is a particularly important one. Is denunciation a duty? The idea here is that HPB was trying to promote an ethics within the Theosophical Society of members supporting each other and coming to each other's defense. But then she got a little pushback about that. What do you do when a theosophist is going off the rails, so to speak? And so she talks about what this means in a theosophical ethical context. There's a wonderful piece called Dialogue Between the Two Editors. These are the two editors of Lucifer, HPB, of course, and Mabel Collins. It's a wonderful predecessor, I suppose you could say, to the dialogue format in The Key to Theosophy. And I consider that also very important and not very well read resource, ideal for discussion purposes in a study group. A dialogue with HPB that came out of one of her oral teaching sessions on the subject of dreams is included in this volume. Some important conversations on occultism with HPB that presumably were recorded by William Q. Judge during a period when they were able to be together, or possibly by letter. It's not clear exactly how these things came to be. And finally, the important resource, Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, which were edited forms of the oral discussions, but a very limited publication of the series that lasted about 5 months. Only a few weeks were involved in these transactions. So this is a point. Once I have offered you the quotation, I'll talk in more detail about the different editions of the transactions and the talks that they were based on. So here's a quotation that I love from Is Theosophy a Religion? Man is but a fallen angel, a god within, but having an animal brain in his head, more subject to colds and wine fumes while in company with other men on earth than to the faultless reception of divine revelations. So there obviously is HPB's sense of humor. So the earliest publication in book form of the Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge was this volume that was brought forth by the Theosophy Company in 1923 and is still available. And what I want to do is very briefly go over the contents of the volume. It has an historical introduction, a reproduction of the stanzas of John, a first transaction which had been published in pamphlet form, including 4 meetings from that was published in January 1880. 4 meetings that occurred in January 1889, and that was published in 1890. An appendix which includes that set of discussions on dreams that I mentioned that are part of volume 10, 2 meetings that happened in December 1888. And a second transaction, including 6 meetings from February to March 1889, that was published in 1891. Now, the reason I'm being so specific here is there were many, many more meetings and many, many more transcriptions that were not included because the originals were lost for many, many years and subsequently recovered in 1992. There's no index in this version. So we have another version by the Theosophical University Press, based on the Theosophical Society in Pasadena. This has an exact facsimile of the 2 transactions plus the dreams piece and an index. So it's worthwhile having so that you can actually find what's included in those transactions. And of course, in the collected writings version, there's an index at the end of volume 10. And in the cumulative index in volume 15, you have the capacity to look up what's in this wonderful set of transactions. So in 2010, the ISIS, or Foundation, the International Study Center for Independent Search for the Truth, which is sponsored by the Theosophical Society Point Loma Blavatsky House in The Hague, they brought together this first publication of a much more complete version of the transactions, transcripts of 22 meetings instead of just 10, January to June 1890, based on shorthand originals that were rediscovered in 1992. And these were edited by Michael Gomes, who offered a wonderful historical introduction. They were also transcribed by him. There are 3 appendices with some useful additional information, and thank goodness, an index. Unfortunately, when this book came out, it was very expensive and hard to get, $100 or so per copy, plus about $24 shipping, and probably much more now that shipping has gone up so high to the United States. So another more reasonably priced edition was brought forward by the Theosophy Company, which is the publishing arm of the United Lodge of Theosophists, the Secret Doctrine Dialogues. This one has a very brief introduction, the same transcripts, although they've been revised and corrected. When Michael Gomes did the original version, he was a good scholar and left brackets and question marks in areas where he was unsure of the reading. And the committee that worked on the Secret Doctrine Dialogues made an effort to, based on other writings of HPB, to substitute those words and provide, in a sense, a more complete version of these transcripts. And of course, also that wonderful edition and index. So what I want to do here is just briefly recommend, for study purposes, and I believe also for scholarly purposes, I think the Secret Doctrine Dialogues in this edition is actually quite effective, and in a sense should supplant the earlier ones that I was pointing out that only include the 10. However, it's also important to understand that historically speaking, for many, many decades, those earlier transactions were the only access that Theosophists had to this material. And therefore, when we're dealing as scholars with some of the people who were writing about them following the 1923 publication of the first one, we need to acknowledge that, in fact, they were using this earlier version. The great value of the Secret Doctrine Dialogues in its full format, however, is you absolutely get the real H.P. Blavatsky. You get the way she spoke. There's no editing of the mistakes that she makes or the grumbling that she makes about what she sometimes is impatient over with respect to the phrasing of the questions. It really is as if you were in the same room with her listening in as a fly on the wall. So these are highly recommended. Okay, continuing, let's move on to volume 11 now. During this period in 1889, the events that were involved with are taking place in London and Fontainebleau. 1889, Annie Besant joins the Theosophical Society. The Voice of the Silence and the Key to Theosophy are published. 3 esoteric instructions are issued, one in January, February of 1889, one in March, April, and one at the end of the year and the beginning of the following year, December of 1889, January 1890. These esoteric instructions have a very complicated publishing history that is especially confusing, I think, for students and for academic scholars. And I want to offer a bit of clarification about this in some of the slides that follow this one. Some gems of volume 11, Chronological Survey from February to October 1889, a piece called The New Cycle that was talking about some theories that the end of a major cycle of the, I guess you could call it the Kali Yuga, although there are different versions of the way it's talked about, was taking place in the late 1890s, according to Blavatsky and some of her theosophical sources, including the Mahatmas. And so she was preparing for this new cycle and also pointing out some of the ways in which the Theosophical Society had already been doing so since its founding. A wonderful article called The Struggle for Existence. The second letter of Blavatsky to the American Convention, the first letter that she sent to the convention, was published in volume 9. The Beacon of the Unknown, which is known both in French from a publication in the Lotus, Le Lotus, and this translation, The Beacon of the Unknown. I won't try to pronounce the French title. What shall we do for our fellow men? Another ethical excursus, so to speak, of the Theosophical Society's purpose. And this is a wonderful quotation, a little on the long side, so be patient, from the New Cycle. But you, friends and readers, you who aspire to something more than the life of the squirrel everlastingly turning on the same wheel, you who are not content with the seething of the cauldron whose turmoil results in nothing, you who do not mistake the deaf echoes as old as the world for the divine voice of truth, prepare yourselves for a future of which but few in your midst have dared to dream, unless they have already entered upon the path. For you have chosen a path that, although thorny at the start, soon widens out and leads you to the divine truth. You are free to doubt while still at the beginning of the way. You are free to decline to accept on hearsay what is taught respecting the source and cause of that truth. But you are always able to hear what its voice is telling you, and you can always study the effects of the creative force coming from the depths of the unknown. I would be willing to take a vote maybe when we get to the question answer section on who has ever seen this, because I don't think it's ever, at least to my knowledge, made it into any of the recent journals since I joined in 2008. Okay, so the actual publication information about the esoteric instructions applies to volume 12. So we'll get into that after we talk a little bit about this volume. So HPB's in London during this period. In 1890, the inner group teachings for a select group of 6 male and female students, which included Annie Besant. A little birthday book of quotations from many of the sacred scriptures of theosophy that are important in theosophy, called Gems from the East, edited by HPB, was published. Another almost completely unknown resource. The Blavatsky Lodge, which was the headquarters of the British section of the Theosophical Society, and Blavatsky herself, moved to the home of Annie Besant in this year at 19 Avenue Road in the area of London. And then we have our gems, of course, the Chronological Survey, an article called Genius, which talks about it as a manifestation of our higher selves. Cosmic Mind, another very important article. The third letter of Blavatsky to the American Convention. Thoughts on the elemental beings that are involved with several things that are of concern to theosophists and that have to do with a differentiation between theosophy and spiritualism. Elementals being not only elementaries, which are beings left over, so to speak, in the astral plane from the astral bodies and sometimes from evil people, and how these can sometimes come forward in seances, and also the elements, the beings of the elements, 4 elements that are often talked about, for example, in Paracelsus. Black Magic and Science, another important article. And we continue. Psychic and Noetic Action, many of you probably have been aware of this one. It's a very fundamental piece. The Whole of Gems from the East is published in volume 12. And then we have an introduction to the esoteric instructions, including what's called the preliminary memorandum, which had to do with the founding of the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society in two different versions, so you can compare them. 5 of the 6 known esoteric instructions, and an appendix with number 3 that includes notes on numbers 1 and 2, and a supplement to number 4. Now I have to mention all of this very specifically because the various publications of these esoteric instructions may or may not include various elements that I'm listing here. For example, already number 6 is missing. And here's a wonderful quotation from the 3rd letter of HPB to the American Convention. This one's probably a little better known than some of the others that I've cited. The ethics of theosophy are more important than any divulgement of psychic laws and facts. The latter relate wholly to the material and evanescent part of septenary man. But the ethics sink into and take hold of the real man, the reincarnating ego. We are outwardly creatures of but a day. Within, we are eternal. Okay, so let's dig in now to the issues connected with the material that's published in volume 12 of the collected writings. First of all, there's the very vexed issue of the so-called 3rd volume of the Secret Doctrine. This was published in 1897, edited by Annie Besant and G.R.S. Mead. And it's now not considered a reliable resource. However, this 1897 volume, which is subtitled Occultism, and was made up of all kinds of leftovers that had never been published or even in some cases completed by HPB, articles and possibly passages from a projected 3rd and even a projected 4th volume of the Secret Doctrine, and then these esoteric instructions. So there was a controversy about her having published the instructions because they were supposedly secret. I won't go into that just now. What I want to point out is the longevity of this volume, which in this form was published from 1897 to 1928, means that it had a huge impact on theosophists and also on esotericists of many descriptions who were actively engaged in the occult revival that started in the 1890s and progressed throughout this period. So it's really impossible for especially academic scholars to ignore this volume, even though in many of the theosophical societies, not just the Adyar group that came forward with this particular publication, it seems to be in disrepute. For a long time, it was the only way that people could read these posthumous writings of Blavatsky, and they were very, very influential. So this includes 3 of the esoteric instructions. So now we're missing numbers 4 and 5 in their 1891 version. 4 through 6 are omitted. There are notes to 1 to 3 that are included. 3 figures in black and white. There are 3 color foldouts that were included in the original pamphlet publications of the esoteric instructions, and they were omitted from this version. 5 diagrams, including several tables and foldouts. Notes on some oral teachings, which were based on a manuscript by one of the members of that inner circle, Isabel Cooper Oakley, in the order in which these notes were delivered, but without any particular editorial support, such as dates. And there is no index in this volume as it was originally published. So it's not a reliable source in some respects if you're writing on theosophy within the Theosophical Society. However, it is something that has to be taken into consideration if you're an academic working outside of the Theosophical Society, or if you're straddling, as I am. So one thing I want to point out is I will be making available a PDF of the slides from this lecture. I know I'm going very quickly, probably more quickly than people can take notes. I'll pass this on to Erica. She will create a link on the YouTube video page, and you'll be able to download this for your own personal study or discussion in a group. If you want to, for example, follow up on studying some of the articles that I've put out here. And at the end of this talk, I'll tell you where you can find some of those articles, aside from the collected writings. Okay, so here again, from 1938 to 71, there was a reset version of this 1897 to 1928 version. The Secret Doctrine was re-released in what's called the Adyar edition in 6 volumes, the 6th volume being an index, and volume 5 now, instead of volume 3, was the one that contained the material that HPB left at her death, the posthumous material that is published under the heading Occultism. So there really doesn't need to be said much about this, except that the page numbers are very different from the earlier edition. And now we have finally the index in volume 6 that allows us to locate what we're looking for in this volume 5. I did discover recently that pre-1928 versions of the Secret Doctrine that were published in 4 volumes had a special index added for the 3rd volume, for the Occultism volume. So there was an index at some point, but I don't yet know when that was actually added. So this book, published in 1980 by Quest Books, The Esoteric Writings of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, is essentially a reprint of the volume 5 of the Adyar edition of The Secret Doctrine. However, it adds the 3 missing colored plates. So that's an important thing. And I recently found that it also added a paragraph that had been missing. I haven't been able to research how much information was in that paragraph, but a paragraph that Annie Besant couldn't find at the time of the 1897 publication, and that subsequently turned up. And there's a very helpful glossary in this edition and an index. Unfortunately, it's been long out of print, and the prices have been going up. It seems to average in its paperback used version $50 to $75 online. So now, what do we have in the 1980 TPH version of volume 12 of the collected writings? We've got the 5 esoteric instructions, including 4 and 5, which were published posthumously. These are in their 1 through 3 are in their 1891 version, same as the Occultism volume. 4 and 5 were based on the oral teachings, but somewhat reorganized, and number 6 from 1900 was omitted. Number 6 is somewhat problematical. It's only really known from a 1900 publication under W.Q. Judge's branch, I guess you could call it, of the Theosophical Society. He had already passed on. Well, okay, I'm getting a little tangled up. I'm trying to remember the name of the actual press that this was, that esoteric instruction was published by, and maybe somebody will be able to help me during the question answer section. I believe it was a reprint of an earlier version, and there were so many splits in the Theosophical Society in America after 1895, it's a little bit confusing. But supposedly, it contains information from some of the Mahatma letters and some of the oral teachings and other material that had already been published by Blavatsky. So it's not really considered to be an authentic esoteric instruction. So this TPH version also includes notes to esoteric instructions 1 through 3 and an important supplement to number 4, which may have been by Blavatsky and by Besson and Judge working together. So Boris de Zirkov makes some notes to the effect that he doesn't consider it completely authentic. The figures are there, the plates, the color plates are there, all the original diagrams are there. He also includes a very important editorial introduction to the formation of the esoteric school. Both versions of the preliminary memorandum are there and other related esoteric instruction documents. All the editing is done by de Zirkov. You would think, though, that this would be the absolute ultimate version of these esoteric instructions, but unfortunately, de Zirkov edited them in some ways so that they're not identical with the original productions. And as a result, some scholars don't consider this version reliable to quote from. And then, of course, there's the index. So now we have some subsequent attempts to bring this information out in more scholarly editions. This intergroup teachings of Blavatsky, the first edition came out from Point Loma Publications in 1985. And it's got a wonderful historical introduction on the intergroup. It includes a collation of a manuscript by Isabel Cooper Oakley, held by the Theosophical Society in Adyar, and one by Alice Leighton Cleather, which is held by I think it's the Theosophical Society in Pasadena, but I may be wrong about that. Someone can correct me if they know otherwise. So there's HPB's famous diagram of meditation is included here, something that many of you may have encountered already. There's an extremely detailed index. Unfortunately, this book is extremely rare, and I've seen it listed for $175 and up online, and almost is unattainable. A subsequent edition, which I highly recommend, but which unfortunately is equally rare, is this second edition, which came out. Both editions were edited by Henk J. Spierenburg. This one not only has the historical introduction, it has the complete Cleather transcript, variant readings from Cooper Oakley and other sources. It has complete ES instructions 4 through 6 with a supplement to number 4. It has diagram 5 from ES instruction number 4, which is missing from some of these publications, HPB's diagram of meditation and an index. So what happened, unfortunately, with this is the publishing stock of Point Loma Publications was destroyed in a wildfire, I think about 15 years ago, and 10 to 15 years ago. And as a result, this book is now extremely rare and, again, extremely pricey. Probably the best edition for scholarly use is this one, put together by Daniel Caldwell, published by Kessinger in 2004. It is still available. It includes facsimiles of all kinds of original material, the original esoteric instructions 1 through 3 in 2 versions, 4 through 6 in 1 version, notes to 1 through 3, supplement to number 4, 3 of the figures in black and white, 3 plates in black and white, 5 diagrams in black and white. However, none of them are as foldouts, which is unfortunate because the print is so small that you almost can't read them without a magnifying glass in this version. Preliminary memorandum in 2 versions and related ES documents. The intergroup teachings, a complete transcript from Cleather. Introduction and notes by Caldwell. Unfortunately, no index. And I didn't mention it, but the color plates are reproduced in black and white, so you don't get to see what they actually look like. So unfortunately, again, there's no volume that includes absolutely everything, but this one is an excellent one to have in your library if you're a scholar of this material. So in 2015, the Philosophical Publishing House brought out this version of the Esoteric Instructions edited by Michael Gomes. Wonderful historical introduction. This is based on the 3rd volume of The Secret Doctrine that we were talking about earlier. He reproduces the first 3 esoteric instructions. He omits numbers 4 through 6. The notes to 1 through 3 are also omitted because they were not actually by Blavatsky. They were by a couple of her students. 3 figures, 3 plates, the color foldouts are included. 5 diagrams, 4 of them as foldouts, 1 is missing. And then the notes on some oral teachings based on Cooper Oakley, but they've been reorganized and alphabetized by subject. So unfortunately, we have a new version here that is wonderful for students, not so good for academics. It includes also a couple of essays that are important to the esoteric school teachings, Practical Occultism and Occultism and the Occult Arts, 2 versions of the Preliminary Memorandum, and HPB's editorial note to Stray Thoughts on Death and Satan by Eliphas Levi. This is because Blavatsky refers to this particular piece in one of the esoteric instructions. So Gomes wanted to make sure that everything you needed to know to understand the esoteric instructions in terms of what HPB published about and around them is present in this single volume. Fabulous for study, not so good for academic scholars, unless you want to buy the Kessinger version, plus this version to get the color versions of the foldouts. And then finally, no index, again, sorry. This little publication by TPH includes the preliminary memorandum, 1 version of it. And I brought this out not so much for scholarly purposes, but both of these documents, the original program of the Theosophical Society, which HPB wrote but never published during her lifetime, and this preliminary memorandum are, I think, extremely important for an understanding of what she considered the Theosophical Society to be about. And it's an excellent volume for study groups to work with. Now, this is carrying forward something that I introduced in Talk 1. This particular quotation, I think, is extremely interesting concerning HPB's writings about mediumship. It comes from an obscure editor's note to Kamaloka and the Bearings of Esoteric Doctrine on Spiritualism, which was an article by A.P. Sinnott published in 1885, and comes in the Collected Writings, Volume 6. Subjective, purely spiritual mediumship is the only harmless kind and is very often an elevating gift that might be cultivated by everyone. This comes as somewhat of a surprise to most people who are aware of HPB's writings against spiritualism from the early volumes of the Collected Writings. What's important about it, though, is to understand that as long as you weren't involved in physical mediumship, actual manifestations of people who've died, a purely spiritual, quote-unquote, mediumship might be justifiable and actually elevating. And in that preliminary memorandum, we actually get a hint of what she was driving at. So here is that particular information. Here, this is a summarized version of what she says in bullet points. Establish belief in existence of the masters, understand their nature and their powers, reverence them in your heart, draw near to them as much as you can, open yourself up for conscious communication with them, especially one to whom you might dedicate your life. Rise to the plane where the masters are without attempting to draw them down to ours. And know that help, instruction, and enlightenment will be given when deserved. So this was very much a part of HPB's idea of the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society, and I think it helps explain what she was talking about in the quote in the previous slide. You can read this in any of the versions of the preliminary memorandum that I've discussed. So moving on to the next volume, volume 13. HPB was in London during this period. The Fifth American Convention occurred in May of 1891, April, I should say, in May of 1891. It was, of course, during this period that Annie Besant went to Boston to that convention to deliver the letters of HPB, but on Annie Besant's return, before she re-arrived in London, HPB had passed on May 8th, as everyone knows. In 1981, Boris Dezerkov passed, and so this is the first volume of the series that he was not involved in from start of assembly to complete production and publication. So there is a chronological survey to this volume. There are some wonderful articles, The Devil's Own Thoughts on Ormuzd and Ahriman, the principles of light and darkness, or so-called good, so-called evil in Zoroastrianism, the negators of science, the actual letters. There were two of them that Annie Besant read at the Fifth Annual Convention. Again, very good sources for the ethics of the Theosophical Society. Civilization, the Death of Art and Beauty, and an important article called My Books, which talks about HPB's attitudes towards the writings that she was able to produce before her passing. A few more. There is a Road Steep and Thorny is included in the collected writings. The exact authorship is unknown, but it's assumed to be HPB, and you may have noticed in the quotation that I brought forward from the earlier volume, volume 11, actually talked about a steep and thorny path, or at least a thorny path. One of the so-called nightmare tales that I talked about in the previous talk from the Polar Lands is included in this volume. The Mind in Nature, an extremely important piece. And here we go, a quotation from a semi-regular column called Literary Jottings. Friends and foes, criticism is the sole salvation from intellectual stagnation. It is the beneficent goad which stimulates to life and action, hence to healthy changes, the heavy ruminants called routine and prejudice in private as in social life. And of course, ruminants are cattle, basically. So the heavy cattle ruminants of routine and prejudice in private as in social life. I think it's pretty important for theosophists to remember this because we have an awful lot of criticism going on, and it's often not taken very well, and sometimes it's not offered very constructively. And yet, friends and foes, HPB welcome criticism, and so much of the amazing writing that's in the collected writings is her response to this criticism. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important for us to know about what she wrote. So volume 14, the last volume of text, includes no lifetime events, obviously, because everything was published posthumously. And I want to go a little bit through some of the publications that came out during the 1890s that include material or refer to material that may have been published, well, that are definitely published in this volume and may have had some reference to earlier writings. There was a book of the so-called nightmare tales, HPB's fiction. The Theosophical Glossary was also published in 1892. In 1893, there was a revised edition of The Secret Doctrine, revised and quote unquote corrected, now considered not to be reliable, even though it was published by Besant and Mead, and the attempt was to try to correct some of the grammatical errors and some of the spelling issues with respect to Sanskrit and other languages and so on. But it has become a convention of all theosophical scholarship, both within and outside, to refer to the page numbers of the first edition. In 1895, A Modern Panarion, which was the first attempt to collect HPB's articles. There was also an index to the revised edition of The Secret Doctrine published. I spoke a little bit about the Modern Panarion in the first lecture. In 1897, we had the Secret Doctrine Volume 3, Occultism, published. We've already discussed that. So some gems in CW 14, No Chronological Survey. There's a foreword by Dara Eklund. She was for many years an editorial assistant working with de Zurkhoff on this collected writings project, and she took over with the editing of this volume. Critically important is de Zurkhoff's essay called The Secret Doctrine, Volume 3, as published in 1897, a survey of its contents and authenticity. He's coming from the non-Adyar approach to this volume, which tends to approach it with a great deal of distrust, and even so far as to wonder whether there ever was a volume 3, possibly a volume 4, and that it somehow disappeared, and a pretty strong statement that the volume 3 was not the volume 3 of the Secret Doctrine. Certainly that's true as far as HPB conceived of it, but there's an alternative opinion that will come up in a different slide. A very important piece is included here called The Mystery of the Buddha, quite a long section that may in fact have played a part in one of the versions of the Secret Doctrine. 3 appendices, one coming from the so-called Würzburg manuscript of the Secret Doctrine, what the Secret Doctrine looked like in 1877 or so, 1886, 1887, before it was edited by the Cateleys for publication in the form in which we know. And here, in 2014, the Eastern School Press came out with a complete version of this Secret Doctrine Würzburg manuscript. This is another important resource both for scholars and for students. It is, in fact, an unrevised manuscript of the AHA 1885 to 1886 version, including material published in the Secret Doctrine Volume 3, 1897, and in the Collected Writings Volume 14. It includes an introduction by David Reigel, a wonderful chronology of the whole coming together of the Secret Doctrine and what happened to it after HPB's death, in a chronology by Caldwell, and a wonderful essay by Caldwell called The Myth of the Missing Third Volume of the Secret Doctrine. I think it's important for people who want to know what this whole controversy about the third volume was about, to read these two different approaches, de Zurkhoff's and Caldwell's. And Caldwell actually lists the items in the third volume of the Secret Doctrine from 1897 that he believes would have been in HPB's mind for her own version of this, and comes up with the conclusion that Annie Besant didn't do too bad a job, so to speak. So here's a wonderful quotation from the Appendix 1 of Volume 14, The Secret Doctrine First Draft to the Readers. The true philosopher, the student of the esoteric wisdom, entirely loses sight of personalities, dogmatic beliefs, and special religions. As there cannot be two absolute infinitudes, so there cannot be two true religions. Esoteric philosophy reconciles them all, strips every one of its outward human garments, and shows the root of one identical with those of every other great religion. Now, a few words before I close about where to find the information we've been talking about if you don't have the money or the space to get all 14 volumes of The Secret Doctrine. Well, I need to mention the index, yes. Dara Eklund and several assistants managed to pour together the indexes from all 14 volumes as they were created by de Zurkhoff in the beginning. Some of the earlier indexes were apparently not as complete as they could have been, so these were amplified. It's a wonderful thing to have if you've got all of the volumes. But if you want access to the collected writings of HPB online, this is the link to have in mind. It's more or less complete. This is a repeated slide from my earlier lecture. As Katinka Hesselink, a theosophist from the Netherlands, said, the full set of Blavatsky's articles, she doesn't bore, she doesn't repeat herself, and she keeps on fascinating. It doesn't include the bibliographies that de Zurkhoff produced. It does have indexes, and it also includes the index to volume 15. For some reason, the chronological survey from volume 1 is missing. So I introduced this set produced by the Theosophy Company in my earlier article. I call it my HPB articles starter set. These 3 volumes sell for under $50 in America, but are unfortunately not shipped beyond America. But 164 articles and essays are included. The first volume deals more or less with first object of the Theosophical Society, brotherhood and ethics. The second volume deals with the third object, occultism and science. The third deals with second object issues of comparative religion. It's a wonderful collection to have if you run a study group and need articles or ideas about articles to include in your syllabus. There's an alphabetical listing of the articles. There's an index in volume 3. It's very beautifully made, highly recommended. And then finally, Nicholas Weeks made me, who was Dara Eklund's husband, and also on that editorial team, reminded me that in 2006, Michael Gomes brought out this HPB Teaches anthology from Adyar. It's a starter set for the starter set, if you will, 40 articles instead of 164, and many of them are among the ones that I recommended earlier in this series of talks. Each is introduced with some contextual information by Michael Gomes. And there is, wonderful to say, an index. So this completes my part 2 of a tour of HPB's collected writings, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have.